Hello, welcome to the Disrupting Intelligence Through Drawing event, which is the final event of the Entrepreneurship Institute's Festival of Disruptive Thinking. My name is Sarah. I am the Head of Communications and Engagement for the Entrepreneurship Institute, and I'm here to moderate this event with Francesca and Peter. For those of you not familiar with the Entrepreneurship Institute at King's, we believe that entrepreneurial people can make the world a better place by solving problems to create a healthier, smarter, more equal and sustainable future. And our role is to work with the whole King's community to help them develop entrepreneurial mindsets that will help them become more creative problem solvers, develop skills that make them more employable or boost their careers, come up with more disruptive and innovative ideas, as well as start and scale successful startups. So a quick intro to our speakers. We have Professor Francesca Happé, is a professor of cognitive neuroscience, and for the last 30 years, her research has focused on autism through the Respect Lab research project. She's actively engaged in studies of abilities and assets in autism and their relation to detailed-focused cognitive style. Some of her recent work focuses on mental health on the autism spectrum and under-researched groups, including women and the elderly. We also have Peter Shenai, a King's artist in residence, whose practice is situated in the interplay of physical objects, sensory cues, play, and novel communication. In Hurricane Bells, an artwork that he produced recently, I want to say, Peter, is that right? Recently-ish, he used meteorological data to cast 5 bells in the shape of Hurricane Katrina, which were taken to New Orleans for the 13th anniversary of the storm and played on by Katrina survivors. So today they're going to talk about the links between drawing and visual language, as well as visual intelligence tests, neurodivergence and creativity. So over to you, Francesca and Peter.
Thanks very much. Peter, you're muted, but Peter's going to kind of lead this and I'm going to chip in. And this has been a really nice collaboration that we hope you'll enjoy seeing some of the creative process.
Thanks, Frankie. I'm now unmuted and I'm going to share my screen. So yeah, this is us. Hello. You'll possibly find out soon how it is that we've drawn these strange masterpieces of self-portraiture. Actually, thanks, Sarah, for giving that brief introduction to Hurricane Bells, because I kind of wanted to open just by giving a tiny bit of background on my artistic practice, and Francesca is going to be able to do the equivalent. So yeah, you did hear that there was a project that's kind of ongoing that started a couple of years ago, where I cast 5 bells in the shape of Hurricane Katrina. So each of these bells are modelled on a particular moment in time during the progression of the storm, with a small little bell that is modelled after the hurricane as it was just as an infant storm brewing out in the Gulf of Mexico, through to the largest bell, which represents the hurricane as it was when it was bearing down on the city of New Orleans and the southern areas of the United States. And because these bells derive their shapes entirely from the structure of the hurricane, when you actually play through them, when you hang them up and you strike them in order, you can actually hear how the power of the hurricane was changing through time. So you hear the tones deepen as you strike through them. And for this project, I worked with a researcher called Carlo Cosaro in Imperial, and we mapped Hurricane Katrina in various different ways, and we experimented with options before deciding on trying to model the hurricane in terms of wind sheets. And eventually what this gave was a kind of continuous series of options of snapshots of the hurricane in 3D. And eventually I chose 5 moments across that trajectory, as you see now, which gave 5 bells, each separated by a 9-hour interval. And as Sarah mentioned, these bells were actually taken to New Orleans, and survivors of the storm played on these bells in kind of very sort of ceremonial, almost ritualistic kind of moments, where they struck the bells exactly 13 years to the moment, to those points that are represented by each of the bells. And they reflected on experiences and talked about the importance of storytelling and kind of remembering the event and the kind of future and the past. And all of this was sort of compiled and reworked into an audio documentary on Radio 4, which you can hear on BBC Sounds if you're interested. And then a very different project. I recently became obsessed with the way that we have used since the 90s a colon, a dash and a bracket to create smiley faces. And of course, with the explosion of emojis, this is something that people do less and less. It's almost starting to look antiquated these days. But actually, I was interested in the fact that when you blow this very simple creative kind of tool up to a size that's kind of large enough to see properly, and when you then play that out in different typefaces, you suddenly discover how it is that these different fonts smile. The character, the personality of these different fonts becomes just entirely manifest. And so I've been playing with contrasting and comparing these large scale kind of manifestations of type personality. And so I'd say generally in my work, working in collaboration, dealing with stories and issues that are important, creating at these intersections between play and communication and research, and bringing something of everyday tools and reinventing them into my work, and trying to kind of find a line between the serious and the playful. All of those things are kind of very important, and they very much feed into the project that we're going to be talking about today. Thank you. Do you want to speak a bit about your side?
Yep. So our original collaboration came about through a King's event, bringing artists and academics together. And I think we were asked to bring along a drawing, and I think this might have been the drawing that I brought, which is a drawing by Nadia. And what you might not know is that Nadia was 3 when she drew these horses, and Nadia had autistic, and also had intellectual disability. And if you gave her a biro, but no other kind of writing instrument, she would produce these absolutely beautiful drawings, even though at that stage she couldn't do up the buttons of her clothes or eat with a knife and fork. And we got into a conversation about drawing, about autism, which is the area that I've worked in for the last 30 years. But what we also got really interested in was how drawing is used to test people. And so that's a big theme of what's going on, and the anxieties people have when they're told we're going to do some drawing, and people immediately think, oh no, I'm terrible at drawing, or oh yes, I'm wonderful at drawing, this is going to be great. So that was the starting point. A bit more, oh, can you go to the next slide, Peter? I'm not sure what it's going to be. Yeah, so a lot of my work has been about the way that autistic people view the world and process the world. And one of the features seems to be an extraordinary and unusual eye for detail, the ability to zoom in on salient details and almost ignore the context. But here you can see Stephen Wiltshire, a wonderful autistic artist who is drawing the cityscape of Tokyo from memory, having taken a 20-minute helicopter ride over the city. And his drawings are remarkably detailed and precise. And although other people on the autism spectrum may not share his extraordinary talent, they typically do have an eye for detail that often exceeds what non-autistic or neurotypical people have. Can I have the next slide? So I often show these in sequence so that you have to see the blank one first and then spot the differences. But seeing that this is a clock mechanism is often enough for a neurotypical person. We don't care about or need to see all the minute details. But if you can see the details, and sometimes if you can ignore that it's a clock mechanism and really focus in on the details, then that's going to help you solve certain sorts of tasks. It also has a resonance with how at least some artists deconstruct what they see and try to leave behind the meaning or reimagine the meaning, rather than get hung up on these generalities like clock mechanism that we might get sucked into, or I might as a neurotypical person. Can we have the next? Okay, that was the thing. So this led to a series of studies and research studies started by Ute Frith, who really focused on the fact that we could learn more about autism by looking at what autistic people are really good at, than we could by banging on about the things that we see as weaknesses. So the differences in social and communication style, for example. So this is the embedded figures test. Your job is to find the simple part on the right of the screen within the complex gestalt, the complex colored figure. And I think if you press again, Peter, it might animate. Oh, no, it doesn't. OK, well, it's highlighted so you can see. Autistic people are often unusually good at that. And it's because we think they can see the figure in terms of its parts rather than as a whole. So the camouflaging is easier for them to break. And then, sorry, the next slide. So we've gone back to drawing in some of our research with autistic young people and tried to look at this eye for detail. And here you can see when we asked, this was a young boy with autism, we asked him to draw a house and he began with the windows. And that's very unusual. Not many neurotypical children will start with a detail. They usually start with a hole. But you can see his final house is lovely and coherent. And then you can see another child who took part, another autistic child who took part, where we asked him to draw a house with 4 windows. And he's drawn the house at the bottom, and then he's stacked up the 4 windows. And he's even put the roof and the chimney on. So everything is there. Everything part that you want is there. But the configuration is not what we might have expected, although sort of beautiful in its own right. Are there any more slides, Peter, from mine? Or, yeah, so this is again coming back to another amazing artist. This is Gilles Tréhin, who has created an imaginary city called Urville. And he has a beautiful book, maybe more than one book now, that shows you the Urville from lots of different perspectives. And I wanted to show this partly because sometimes people think that autism is at loggerheads with creativity, and that's just not true at all. It might be that autistic people imagine things in different ways from non-autistic people, but just because autistic people like to know what's going to happen next and rather dislike change does not mean that they aren't creative. And I think there's a slide to follow to illustrate that. So here we have a clear illustration that you can be very repetitive, which is often a characteristic that autistic people enjoy, and you can be very, very creative. And I think that might be the end of my little pass, is it, Peter? Oh, no, this is just, shall I say that one? And then I think I finished.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So this is, this illustrates, it's an illustration by Axel Scheffler, but it illustrates an incident that happened when I was a PhD student and I went to visit Lorna Wing, who's one of the founding mothers of autism research in this country. And she had an autistic daughter. And Lorna was a clinician. She worked at the Institute of Psychiatry most of her life. When I went to visit her, she had just seen a little boy and was assessing him. And she said she started off the assessment by asking him to name all the various toys and things they were going to use. And he named the little doll and the bed and the quilt. And then she pointed to the little toy pillow and said, "What's this?" And he said immediately, "A piece of ravioli." And Lorna said when she looked again at the pillow, it looked exactly like a piece of ravioli. It was the right size, the right shape, the right color. But she would never have seen it that way in the context of the bed. So this young man's perception wasn't faulty. If anything, you could say it was more accurate, but it was context free. He was able to somehow zoom in and to see this object in its own right, rather than through the lens of the context. And I think that different way of seeing the world is part of the inspiration for the first project that Pete and I had together.
Yeah, thanks so much, Frankie. That's brilliant. One of the examples that that I was first introduced to as we started this collaboration is the Draw a Man test. And in this test, children are asked to draw a man. For some reason, it's, a man and not just a person. And as you can see in the illustration on the left, you're getting credit for a kind of very anatomically led understanding of what a successful drawing of a person is going to be. So the more eyelashes you put in, the better. The right number of fingers you put in, getting the right number of details and getting as many details in the right place is the kind of name of the game. And it made me and Frankie reflect quite a lot on how some of the wonderful drawers of the past and the present would score on this test. So I mean, it's slightly playfully put, but Michelangelo's beautiful contour of the back on the left really shows a huge amount of detail of the features of how a back looks, but they're very, very smooth and continuous. So exactly how many could you count there, and how would you rate that on the Draw a Man test score? Similarly with Matisse, this portrait in the center, there's so much personality and suggestion given by only a few lines, but the lack of any the lack of any eyelashes might detract from his score. And with Picasso's wonderful single line drawings of animals, again, there's really no easy way to distinguish between features in some of them, particularly the kind of mouse, the sort of second along. And in Julie Meritu's work, she's one of my favorite artists. She does these huge abstract, semi-abstract drawings that combine architectural plans with abstract forms and kind of bunting and things of festival and stadia. It's very hard to make out details here, and something about her abstraction, even though it shows something wonderful with form, wouldn't really do on a test which is meant to be purely figurative. And so we were sort of thinking about other examples that do draw out something of the kind of celebration of stylistic diversity, and the fact that when we draw, we can be discovering as we go, and we can be innovating and creating as we go. It doesn't have to just reflect some knowledge that we already do or don't have. And one of the best examples of this is tea towels. I really recommend any of you, if you haven't looked, if you have ever been part of a school tea towel, if you go and try and find it, and go and try and find people in your class or yourself if you did one of these drawings, because it's just a very extraordinary process to look back through these drawings and see how people are discovering and experimenting, and kind of experimenting not just with how they see the world, but even with how they see themselves. And drawing has been used as a tool in many contexts to open up ideas and an invitation to reflect for adults. So this is the duck rabbit, which is a drawing that was adopted by Wittgenstein in his philosophical investigations. And Wittgenstein uses drawing quite a lot to kind of demonstrate quite tricky tensions. And in this one, he's interested in the fact that you can see both a duck and a rabbit, or at least you can see two kind of animal-like forms. And he refers to this moment when you realize that there is a second animal there as the dawning of a new aspect. And he becomes very interested in what it is for us to be in a position, a mind position, where we can begin to see more than one thing existing in the same stimulus. And then this is a more contemporary example. So I don't know if any of you have ever gone on Google Quick Draw. For any of you that haven't, it's a kind of huge online database of drawings done by anybody that accesses the site. And to illustrate how it works, I'm going to hopefully be able to play a video. Oh yeah, here we go. If it will load. Sorry, just bear with the technology for a second.
Oh, I know, it's submarine.
So you are given these instructions to draw something, and you begin to draw it, only having 20 seconds, and the AI
Or nail. Oh, I know, it's wine bottle.
is making these guesses, and eventually it guesses what it is. And it's comparing what you're drawing with other drawings that people have made. And so it's kind of cycling through surreally, kind of going, oh, it's a wine bottle, it's a castle. Oh no, it's actually a knee or something.
Or circle. Oh, I know, it's blueberry.
It's a lot of fun. I really recommend you try it out. The thing is, there is something about this whole space that is nonetheless quite restrictive. So from all the diversity of drawings that have been composed of dogs, at the point that I looked, there were almost 1,500 drawings of dogs that people had done. It then invites you to click on any that don't seem to accord properly with the kind of Aristotelian idea of what a perfect dog looks like. And indeed, it's trying to kind of take all of this diversity and gather it into a few consistent archetypes, which it's then going to kind of refer to as a proper dog. And anything that's sitting outside of that it will, not recognize as a dog. So there's a kind of standardization policing that happens even with some of these very creative examples. And so what we wanted to do was begin to react to really all of that and develop drawing exercises that would at once subvert the restrictive qualities of a test and at the same time try and offer something that was reflective, exploratory, that invited a playfulness, but that would nonetheless still offer some kind of positive challenge that is going to promote a lot of stylistic diversity. So I'm just going to run you through a little snapshot of some of the exercises that we've been running. Frankie, I don't know if you want to say anything about the kind of diversity of people that we were kind of engaging across these exercises.
And I was just going to say that returning to that issue of, now we're going to do some drawing. Oh no, I'm a bad drawer. Oh no, I'm a good drawer. The idea was to have exercises where everybody was slightly off kilter, slightly put off balance, so that everybody is doing something new and nobody is a good drawer and nobody's a bad drawer. We're all just doing something that's really different. And that's really, again, very much in the spirit of neurodiversity too, to say that, like the tea towel, these are all fabulous and fantastic, and none of them are better than any others, because this isn't a test. It's very much, getting away from that idea of drawing as testing. Absolutely.
And this one is honestly just brilliant to play in almost any context, in a cafe with friends, online with other people. I've had a lot of fun opening a lot of workshops doing this exercise, and the simple instruction is that you draw a face, or you can draw an object, whatever you like, but the rule is you have to not look down at the page. And the results are always entirely surprising, because something about the loss of eye-hand coordination creates, I think, actually a very creative sort of set of ways of coping with this strange challenge. And as people draw even the same face multiple times over, you see entirely different approaches, because you're forced to just kind of think creatively about how you're going to approach this strange task, and it brings up all these surreal and wonderful results. And then another exercise is very much a subversion of the draw a man or the draw a person instruction, and rather than draw this person with as many features in the right place or whatever as possible, the invitation is to draw with very few features. So in some cases, just draw 3 features. And what you get there is a kind of interesting point around which features are chosen, how they sum together to give a sense of a person or a sense of a character there. And also when those drawings are compared side by side, how there is something that we can all do in our brains, which is sort of see resonances between drawings and kind of build up pictures that aren't physically brought together on the same plane, but can kind of be compiled across different drawings. And then in another set of exercises, which I've kind of loosely been calling sort of the tango exercises, we invite people to draw with both hands at the same time. And the idea is that you're going to have either 1 or 2 sheets of paper. Both of your hands are going to have a pen each, and you are going to simultaneously with both hands try and draw the same object. And there are a lot of really interesting reactions that come from people. Some people do find this very, very weird and challenging. I think most of us do. But quite a few people talk about empathy and the idea that somehow, because you're drawing in a way that's so unfamiliar in one hand and so familiar in another, that it's like you can kind of have this sense of being both very capable and very incapable at the same time. And it kind of almost leads to both an empathy for others, but almost an empathy for yourself, for your own struggle. And so in iterations of this exercise, I invite people first to try and give their attention to their non-dominant hand. And there are some people that are ambidextrous, and that is honestly just a privilege to meet anybody that's ambidextrous. It's great. But for many of us, that's not the case, and it's quite clear which is our dominant and which is our non-dominant hand. And then repeating this exercise or iterating it, inviting people to focus on their dominant hand. And you can see just in the comparison there just how different these drawings are. And it isn't the case that sort of the dominant hand is just kind of doing something in the same way each time, and the non-dominant hand is just failing in one case and, you know, succeeding in the other. It's actually that there is just a very different set of stylistic coping mechanisms going on. And then when you contrast that with the invitation to synchronize that focus and give focus to both hands, again, there's something very different going on. Nothing is ever the same between these drawings. And I think this leads to some really beautiful results, especially when you kind of look at these and reflect on them side by side. It's maybe a bit of a choice example to kind of make this statement, but I often feel when I look back at people's drawings that it's almost as if I'm watching the same drawing have the wind ripple through it in just slightly different ways. And there's just these rather beautiful permutations on the same kind of style. And then another set of exercises are more focused on how people can recall and kind of using imagination. So in this exercise, we invite somebody to take on the role of a storyteller. And the storyteller is going to recall a place that they know really well. So it could be a bedroom, a childhood bedroom, say, or a garden, or the street that they grew up on, anywhere. And as they describe this place, everybody else is drawing. And there is an invitation for that process to become collaborative. So as people are drawing, they might start to query particular details, and they might ask the storyteller, oh, you mentioned there's a pot on this shelf. How large is the pot? What's in the pot? And so you develop this kind of idiosyncrasy of communication in the group that mediates between everyone's drawing, the storyteller's kind of telling, and the kind of reflection between those two things. And it's really exciting every time that people kind of reveal their drawings. Another set of drawing tasks kind of play with haptic, so touchy-feely moments where people actually have objects in their hand and they're either describing those objects for other people or they're just drawing what they can feel. And there was quite a lot of learning with a lot of these exercises, but I think particularly in this exercise, thinking about how a narrative voice describes with more or less kind of planning in place. So just kind of haphazardly describing details from across the object as they occur. That was more of a not necessarily positive challenge for some people, whereas in some cases people feeling the object for a bit and then deciding on a kind of narrative about how they're going to kind of feel back over and describe it that has a little bit of a kind of structure to it was for those people sometimes a better alternative. And I'm just in the interest of time, I'm not going to go too deep into these, but these are exercises in which people are invited to look at an object for 2 minutes, and then they can study it in scrutinous detail, and then they put it away, and then they just have to draw it from memory. And it's very interesting sort of seeing how it is that memory works in this kind of short to medium term. A lot of people say that it's extraordinary how their image just suddenly goes out their head when they take the object away, and yet other people find that they develop new kinds of ways of coping with this kind of interesting challenge. And coming to sort of certain groups that were quite keen to kind of reflect and look at drawings afterwards, it was quite useful taking this role of actually inviting people to curate drawings and to kind of see where there could be resonances between them. And that also kind of helps to kind of establish more conversation around how people can feel interested in their drawing as a point of difference rather than at a point of being correct or incorrect. So going to move on to now talking about where this project is kind of heading in the future. Frankie, I don't know if you want to maybe give a little bit of a description as to what we're looking at here.
Yes, I can say a bit about this. So up to now, we've been looking at when how people have been asked to draw and their drawings have been judged. So in the Draw a Man test, traditionally children's developmental level, excuse me, or mental age was judged by how they drew, with, as Peter said, no account taken of stylistic elements or how a child understands the instruction draw a man. What's the point of it? And there's a parallel and a wider history around intelligence testing using drawn materials or visual materials. Sometimes we ask the individual to engage with them by drawing. And the picture completion test is an example of this, where you're sometimes asked to draw a part onto an incomplete figure. And I think you can see some of those in black and white here. And you think about being asked to draw onto a face. You could draw anything. You could draw a tattoo on the face. You could draw a moustache on a lady. You could draw a mask. Now might be the most salient thing to draw on rather than somebody's mouth. But the idea behind these tests is that there is one correct answer, this sort of convergent idea, which is so interestingly at odds with the artistic approach of divergence, and is also obviously critically unfair to at least some groups of neurodivergent people, because how do we know what to draw onto the face that has no nose? Well, we infer that the examiner thinks that the most important missing part is the nose, or that the examiner wants to test whether we know that there's a nose on a face. So we are kind of second guessing the tester's intention. But if your mind works differently from the tester's, that's going to be very difficult. And the most salient thing for you might be the earlobe, which should have an earring because that's what would fit for you. So this is really in keeping with the project that we've already done, but taking it now to visual testing more generally and the whole history of visual testing.
Yeah, that's right. So we've basically been enjoying delving into the archives and looking at a lot of these tests. So there are a series of amazing drawings that you're seeing here, which invite you to notice what's missing, and they have their own kind of surreal sort of quality to them. And as Frankie was saying, there's actually a number of different ways that you can interpret what it is that's missing, and actually what kind of a request it is very different in different cases. So to know something about what's missing in the light bulb case, I mean, you have to have a knowledge of the filament in light bulbs, and you have to feel that that's the important thing, and that this isn't actually just a very stylistic bulb from Made that has a design feature, which is that you don't have to see the filament or something. And as you move through these, not seeing the black keys on a piano, again, is very much led by kind of understanding design conventions rather than some kind of strict understanding of what missing means. Again,
and Peter, if you go back to the previous one for a moment, because I would think the bath one is so funny, because obviously they're trying to test whether you know that there should be a plug hole.
Yeah.
But the plug hole could be at the end that you can't see. Yeah. That would be perfectly fine. And certainly I know autistic people who would say, what's missing? Well, what's missing is the rest of the bathroom. So all the other yellow tiles and ugly orange flooring is missing, which is a perfectly good answer. But the artistic convention that somehow you can just have sort of a bit showing and infer the rest, there's no reason that anybody else should share that. Yeah,
completely. It's it kind of comes back to this point that in Wittgenstein, with the dawning of a new aspect, that the sense of what's different is very limited in terms of which aspect needs to be the difference. But yeah, there are so many differences that you can call out. Maybe it works to have one of the holes in the whistle on the underside. Maybe there's a potential design there that can work. I don't know. And then you get these rather sort of gendered kind of examples where something about the convention about how we should wear our bodies and sort of biological norms are at play.
This is another one that's it's really interesting in terms of the examiner's intention. So you can imagine that, why has this guy got quite so much hair, and why has he got a moustache? Well, it's so that you don't think that he doesn't have eyebrows because he doesn't have any facial hair. So they've really kind of put that message like right there. But can you read that message? Can you pick up that intention? That's very cultural, and that's very neurotypical cultural. And what's missing? Well, of course, his body is missing, isn't it? His body is missing. He's just a disembodied head. So what a funny thing to ask somebody, what's missing in this picture?
Yeah, yeah. And then in other examples, you're invited to take a series of tiled drawings which have action of some kind taking place in them, and you have to rearrange them in the correct order. And of course, immediately my artistic brain just jumped to wanting to find the narrative for all of the wrong orders, because there is some kind of interesting series of mishaps and sudden resolutions if things aren't happening in the order that are necessarily intended. Just as a kind of point of reference for the project, this is a book by Alejandro Zambra, who is a Chilean author. And in Chile, when he was growing up in the sort of latter part of the 20th century, it was absolutely rote, as it was in many countries, to have multiple choice exams at the end of each year at school for pretty much the entirety of school. And so this is such a kind of culturally drilled in point for him that he ended up actually writing a sort of very experimental novel, which takes the form of a multiple choice test. But it plays with this idea and it subverts it. So you're often asked to put 5 sentences, say, in the right order. So if you look on the page on the right, but there is no obvious right order. In fact, what you're really trying to do is find an order that somehow resonates with you in certain ways. And actually, you'll find that when you put these sentences in different orders, they have dramatically different meanings and they evoke different things about stuff like family and money and society, the very kind of deep things that affect us all. And yet all that's happened is you've played a multiple choice test. So that is kind of a bit of a sort of touch point for us in terms of inspiration in relation to this bigger ambition to kind of take visual-based intelligence tests and playfully subvert them to see if we can kind of disrupt something to create a more playful kind of open-ended experience. And we're interested in as much in the kind of environmental features through the 20th century that people have taken these kinds of tests in. What's it like to actually sit at a desk and take a test? What's it like to be separated? What if there was an invitation to cheat, to swap desks? So this is all in the mix at the moment. I'm just gonna, how long have we got on time? Okay, I'm just gonna very quickly play a video. I'm not gonna give it too much introduction. I'm just gonna play it. So maybe some of you have seen that video before. For those of you that haven't, Frankie, do you want to maybe say a little bit about that video?
So that's that's by Haydn Simmel, and it was an illustration really of how very, very simple movement patterns can elicit, at least from some of us, quite complicated stories. And Wiltshire and I have created some modern examples in order to look at how readily individuals will read intentions and meanings into these very simple stimuli that don't have faces. They don't look like they're expressing anything, but somehow just by movement pattern, many of us can see a story there. But of course, the story is fiction. There's nothing really there. It's just whatever you bring to it. And there are sometimes differences between what different neurodiverse groups or different neurodiverse individuals will bring to it, very different perceptions. So I don't know whether you want to play that, Peter, if you can.
Oh, it is going to play. Great stuff. Sorry.
Yes, so that's just one of the examples. But I think, Peter, if you go on to the next slide.
Yeah, so this is basically a sneak preview of one of the sort of exhibit ideas that we want to develop, where we want to work with the literal shapes and colors and forms that you find in the Raven matrices test, which is one of these very typical parts of visual intelligence testing. And we want to then talk to people across a very, very broad range and have some stories and some experiences shared with us through audio of taking tests such as these, the challenges, the successes, the downsides, every kind of element of how people have experienced these tests. And we then want to, akin to those kinds of very simple shape animations, take these shapes and animate those conversations, bring them to life, showing the sort of the struggles and the challenges and the kind of experiences. So that's kind of an open invitation, actually, as we sort of begin to kind of bring the project out for anybody that does have experiences with these tests, if anybody does and wants to share their experiences. That's sort of one of the things that we're going to begin sort of doing.
And I think the other thing in the spirit of those sort of grid-like IQ tests is, again, there's one correct answer. But what if we line up our elements, our verticals and horizontals, so that there is no one answer? So, you know, if you have a pig, a lemon, and an empty space, and on the other hand, you have a traffic light, a lizard, and then an empty space, what's the convergence of those two completely unrelated sets of things? It's an invitation to do whatever you want. There's no right answer. Mm-hmm. And so our kind of one of our working titles for this project going forward is, don't worry, there's no right answer, because there is no right answer. Usually we say, don't worry, there's no wrong answer. But in this case, we're all wrong and we're all right at the same time. Yeah,
perfect. Thanks. I don't know if we've got, hopefully we've got a few minutes for questions.
We definitely have time for questions.
Okay.
Thank you for such an insightful and engaging talk, both of you. And I'm also loving how lively the chat has kind of been. I don't know if you've managed to get a glimpse of the comments. I can't see any specific questions there, but please do put them in the chat. But we do have a lot of comments around the diversity within neurodiversity and ADHD, the representation of deafness and neurodiverse experiences. So much great stuff going on here. While people are kind of formulating the questions, I will kick off, and I'm really interested to know, both Peter and Francesca, how does this work fit in thematically with your research or your art practice?
Why didn't you start, Peter?
Yeah, well, I think sort of touched on it slightly at the beginning, but working in partnership with researchers is just such a privilege and so exciting to me, because I think it's really interesting when you discover quite how far creativity is shared between different kinds of practitioners, but there's just always this ever so slightly different kind of tweak to what creativity can mean that you discover. So I went to an event a few years ago, which was billed as being a kind of artists and scientists kind of creative workshop situation, a bit like the one that I met Frankie at. But there was a sort of faux pas that was committed, which was that the artists were referred to as creatives and the scientists were referred to as, I think, scientists. And I think somebody brought this up. They were like, we're creatives too. We've got a different kind of creative mindset. And I think vice versa, there is often actually a logic and an analytical kind of mindedness to art, especially once it's kind of established, you know, the rules that it wants to play in. There is often a kind of combination of those two things. And I think there's often something very rewarding about working with people at that kind of intersection. But perhaps moreover, just that it kind of feels thematic with my work, because I'm discovering the more that I work with researchers generally, that actually play is kind of at the heart of a lot of people's work. And it's amazing, you know, meeting somebody whose work is so involved with drawing as well. It's actually been a real spur to kind of bring drawing back into my work. So yeah.
And for me, I guess I can see a parallel between the way that we're trying to take these very closed IQ tests and really open them up with the way that, say, in the understanding of autism, things have progressed from a very medical model where effectively autistic people were told that they did social wrong and they got communication wrong, to a much more neurodiversity and social and mixed model that understands that autistic people process the world differently, they do social differently, but that akin to people speaking different languages, there's no right or wrong. It's just about how we manage to make a translation that everyone can live happily with. So I think there are kind of themes there, and really this idea of creativity being present in all sorts of forms, and creativity in repetition, for example. My interest in perverting the IQ tests is really comes from having given IQ tests to autistic and other children and adults. And I think IQ tests are valuable for all sorts of reasons I could talk about, but that when you see how a really fresh brain takes these materials and sees something completely different, like the ravioli pillow example, comes up with an answer that's a beautiful answer, but then you go to the scoring manual and there's no way to score that. But it really shows that our way of looking at it is very, very limited. And these are, you know, really should be invitations to play, really. And that's what we want to do.
It resonates with a lot of the work we do at the Entrepreneurship Institute in terms of ideation. In the workshops that we run, we really invite people to step into that space of play and abstraction, to be able to, you know, use your brain in a different way that you would normally, and kind of subvert the logic and the, you know, the kind of rationale of playing a game versus playful play.
Yeah.
I'm going to go to the audience now. We do have quite a few questions here. So we've got one from Masunde about any communities or groups you'd like to work with in the future.
So in the drawing workshops, we particularly, well, first of all, I should say we planned that before the pandemic. And so it had to kind of go online, which presented different interesting creative possibilities that we couldn't have been able to do in person. We did have the ambition to take it to quite a lot of different sorts of groups. In the end, we invited neurodiverse and neurodivergent adults to take part, but the workshops were open to everybody. But we've certainly benefited a lot from consulting with and currently co-creating with autistic individuals. But it's certainly an interesting point in the chat about how ADHD people also have different perspective on the world, and I certainly know that from you know, family and relatives. So it would be nice to go really widely and see how these things resonate. I think there'll be open exhibitions, but we'll probably do some special consultation with different groups and see what their views are.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that what we have is a chance to slightly expand the project generally, and what that partly does mean as well is expanding the groups that we're speaking to. We're interested in all of the groups that were mentioned. Yeah.
Great. We've got a question here from Luca about the kind of process of the work. So have people had, once they do the drawings, he wants to know more about the kind of conversation and dialogue that happens afterwards, and the kind of learning that takes place after that, after the actual drawing.
Yeah, well, so it's pretty organic in a sense, because some groups are very proactive and talkative, and some groups are less so, and some individuals are like that, but there often is a bit of a kind of group atmosphere that develops. And so sometimes you have to be very flexible and good at sort of listening to how people are feeling, and try and bring out that discursiveness through choosing exercises that are not going to challenge too much early on, for instance. However, having said that, there are some examples which often do tend to really bring conversation out. Some of the examples that involve storytelling often do bring that out, because suddenly people become very interested in the interconnections between the ways that they've interpreted things differently, but there is a real strong sense that nobody's perfectly drawn somebody's bedroom. And also, in trying to encourage people to speak as they're drawing, you start to get kind of live feedback about feelings and experiences more generally. So it's not always clear whether or not some of that conversation happens before the drawing, during the drawing, or afterwards. But certainly it's something that I would like us to be able to do more of as we hopefully move out of the restrictions of the pandemic, to have a bit more kind of ongoing communication just sort of right after the drawing exercise, because I would say that's slightly difficult in the Zoom format. And hopefully as we start to do things like the immersive workshop options within the exhibition, it'd be really nice to see how that conversation goes on more broadly, you know, through sort of feedback that people can kind of leave. Yeah.
I think we're also playing with some ideas for hopefully an in-person exhibition where the visitors and people engaged in the exhibition can build up stories over time with other visitors. So you saw the picture sequencing task that Peter showed you, but if we ask people who are coming along to add the next picture to a sequence that's evolving over the weeks or days of the exhibition, so feedback, well, dialogue with other people who are enjoying we hope the exhibition.
But and actually I would also add on top of that there is, at the root of all of this, is a wish to try and be accessible on multiple different levels, depending on how people want to engage. So actually there were quite a few drawings you saw there that weren't taken part within group workshops. There were some people who were individuals for whom the idea of doing this in a group actually was a bit maybe unpleasant, or at least just a kind of challenge that they didn't want to face. But the interface between having some instructions and then doing the drawing and then feeding back, possibly in a slightly more public format, you know, having them as part of drawings that are, you know, there on a sort of online format, and maybe then feeding back through writing their experiences. It's important to have that as an option, you know, for some people, as well as the options for much more sociable kind of live interactions. So everything across that spectrum is kind of important.
Fabulous. I'm going to invite any last questions. I can see some people typing away. I want to ask about, and I know, Peter, you touched on this a little bit, but the kind of the scientific and the artistic collaboration, and you know how I know the King's Artist in Residence program through Culture does many of these collaborations, and I kind of want to dig in a little bit further about kind of your experience. Do you think it's really, like, you know, how have you found it working with someone kind of that does something very different or thinks very differently? And how do you think, you know, what kind of possibilities might there be for these kinds of collaborations?
I mean, I've got a slightly grandiose answer to that, which is that a lot of so-called art of the past emerged from people who were just as ready to go and do maths and, you know, look into biology and ask philosophical questions. And it feels to me as if the joining together of these kinds of collaborations is a signal towards a potential culture that doesn't see these distinctions that we've kind of built up through time as necessarily boundaries that can't be porous. And I think it's really good when there is more porosity between disciplines. I think it kind of generates all kinds of creative reactions that just can't happen when we're sort of sitting in our silos. But also, just specifically speaking artistically, I think that so many interesting things have come out of these kinds of collaborations, and it's kind of happening in tandem with things like the information revolution, and the fact that people are using data and the kind of power of scientific sort of insight and kind of technology in their work more and more. So I sort of feel like giving a bit of a narrative to how the world is changing around us with relation to science, technology, and kind of general inquiry. It's really important that artists and scientists are collaborating, because it's sort of a way of actually giving a narrative structure to what's happening. Yeah.
How about you, Francesca? How did you find it changed your kind of research practice?
Well, I don't know how it will impact my research practice, but I think that that thinking creatively about these things and questioning and thinking back about the history of IQ testing and things, it's been really interesting. And actually, I think that Peter and I see things very similarly from different perspectives. And it's just, you know, it's what's so nice is to be able to actually meet again in person and actually just bounce ideas off each other. And it's going to be a really fun project. The idea is to make people laugh, among other things, to question some of their assumptions, but also to laugh. And, you know, I think it's just been a joy so far. And science is creative. So, you know, there really aren't any boundaries of that sort. There shouldn't be. And just as we're saying, there are no right or wrong answers, and certainly no right answers to the things that we're going to put forward. That's very much how it is in science too. You're testing hypotheses, but you're never saying this is absolutely so. You're always in that balance between evidence and theory. So we're going to get people to theorize more and have fun, we hope, with these tasks.
I think I might leave it on that high note. That was a fabulous talk. So interesting. Thank you both, Francesca and Peter, for joining us this afternoon, and everyone in the audience for joining us this afternoon. I hope you really enjoyed it. I absolutely did. Yes, I can't thank you enough for your time.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone, especially for your comments in the chat. They're really interesting and insightful. So we'll be reading all those and thinking hard.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah.